Today on Let's Talk Estate Planning, we're going to talk about what happens when somebody passes away and you find yourself as the executor or you're the successor trustee. We're also going to talk about preparing to make those days a little bit easier for the people in your plan when it happens to you. Because Keith Richards may live forever, but none of the rest of us are going to. I'm Jim Miskell. This is Let's Talk Estate Planning, the podcast that's dedicated to the proposition that, estate planning just makes things a lot easier for families when grief and crisis strikes. And it's my dream that every family gets theirs in place before grief and crisis strikes so that when those transitions occur, family members can do what they really ought to be doing, in my view. That's spending time with one another, supporting each other, and helping to get through those difficult times. I'm a lawyer in the state of Georgia, 30 plus years. This podcast is not legal advice. This podcast is information. It's hopefully educational. It's hopefully a little bit entertaining. I understand that I find estate planning fascinating and just expect that everybody else does too. I realize that's not the case, so hopefully we've made it a little bit entertaining as we go. But back to my point is this is not legal advice. Legal advice happens when you sit down with an attorney who you're paying to give you their opinion, and they are spending time asking those questions that come after their initial answer of "it depends." Because what happens when you ask any attorney a question, the first answer you get is, well, it depends. What does it depend on? A bunch of other questions they're getting ready to ask you about what's going on in your life, your family, your finances, and your situation. That's when legal advice happens. A podcast ain't it. So that's my disclaimer. This is entertainment, information, hopefully some education to get you on the way to making good decisions about getting your planning in place and to enhance your understanding of estate planning as you make those decisions. So I met with my client, Sam, a couple of weeks ago. He was in because his wife, Mary, passed away. They had set up a trust plan with me and had refreshed it last year. And part of that process, of course, was funding the trust and getting everything in place. Sam's a retired engineer, so he's very detail-oriented. So when we gave him that checklist for funding, here's what you need to do. If it's this kind of account, do this. This kind of account, you need to do this. He and Mary got after it and got it done. Last week when we met, he was really wanted a checklist. Can you give me a checklist for the assets in the trust? And I ended up giving him a checklist. He said, this is almost the same as the checklist you gave us when we did funding and made sure everything was in the trust the way it was supposed to be. That's exactly right. It is also the same checklist that people use when they've been named executor, when somebody passes away and they're getting ready to marshal and organize the assets. All right, so Sam came in, and of course, one of the big questions was, what do I have to do now? Mary passed away. She had a prolonged illness. I understood what I was doing there. I was focusing on caregivers, making sure she had what she needed, doing what I could myself, and then following through with all those kinds of things. And now that she's passed, my attention has turned toward the accounts and the assets and the trust that we put together. This is where we had this conversation about checklist. It's interesting because recently I did a workshop, and I do a couple workshops a month, but I had somebody ask an unusual question. I very often get the questions, hey, sounds like a trust is better. Yeah, for most families, it probably is. Probably better, works better. It's probably cheaper beginning to end than a will plan. Yep, get that question a lot, those kinds of things. But this woman, when I explained the basic idea behind a living trust versus a will, that the important part is, and in this particular workshop, I was talking about a box or a basket that you create. And when somebody passes away and you're the executor, that box or basket is their estate. And it's the estate of, if I'm the one who died, it's the estate of dead Jim. And part of the executor's job is to get those assets, anything that's in my name individually, into the box or basket. And I had used that, extended that analogy to talk about living trust and talked about how the difference was you make your own box or basket. And instead I would call it the estate of living Jim or Jim's living trust. And I get the things in it myself. Hand shot up and she said, so what you're saying is it's really important if you have a trust plan to make sure stuff is in the basket, stuff is in the box. I love that question because she really picked up on what we're talking about today and a conversation Sam would have been very comfortable with, because as soon as you build a trust, your next job really is funding the trust. The way we operate that for most of our clients that have the ability to do it is with a checklist that says if it's this kind of account, here's how you want it titled. Best case for accounts, and there are some exceptions, but usually you want that account retitled into the trust so that it's automatically in that box or basket, can be managed by the trustee. While the trustee's fine, while the person who makes the trust is fine, when they become disabled, it's at the disposal of the successor trustee. Likewise, when the trust maker dies, it's at the disposal of the successor trustee. And so this process begins with an inventory of what those assets, what those accounts are, where they are, how they're titled, what are the beneficiary designations, are they appropriate to go into the trust, should they be owned by the trust, should they be beneficiary designated to the trust. That is the first step, is making that inventory. Same step that an executor goes through. Once the executor has the authority from the court to act, because remember, executors are nominated, they're not appointed in the will, and it requires action of the probate court for them to have the authority in the will. But once they do, and they're about this process, it's the same checklist. And number one is making that inventory. How are the assets titled? Were there beneficiary designations so that we can determine next steps to go? Because Sam and Mary had spent the time making the inventory and following the funding instructions, all the next steps questions, what happens now, were actually answered by the body of the trust. They weren't going to have to get those answers, or Sam wasn't going to have to get those answers from the judge. He really didn't even need those answers from me. It was a good time to make a new certificate of trust for him that reflected Mary's death, reflected him as the sole trustee going forward. But as far as the operation of the trust, it's all laid out in the document, and it's laid out in the document per the conversation and instructions that Sam and Mary and I had when we were putting this thing together and freshening it up last year. So that led me to the observation that the checklist for trustees in funding the trust and the checklist for executors in marshaling assets for someone's estate, very, very similar. It's the same work. It's just on a different day. And I talk about this a lot. One of the big differences between a living trust and a will is not that the living trust makes a bunch of work go away. The difference is who does that work and when it happens. With a living trust, when you create that and you set about this checklist of assets and accounts, you're doing it calmly. You haven't died. Nobody's died. Everything's fine. You can think clearly and do all these things, and you don't have all these other pressures on your mind. Contrast that with, okay, now somebody's died and you're the executor. More times than not, the executor is executor for somebody they loved, somebody that they not just knew, but loved and had a long-term relationship with. And now they're asked to go through coldly and analytically, make determinations about, are the accounts appropriately named and what do we do about it now? So that's one of the real strengths of this trust plan, and is you get to do it now when everything's calm, so the people you care about don't have to do it later when they're in the middle of grieving. So that's the basic same checklist. Hey, Jim Miskell here. Sorry to interrupt the episode. Hope you're enjoying today's content. A lot of times when folks are thinking about this kind of thing, questions spring to mind. If you have questions, we like to do some question and answer episodes. So you can go to our website, letstalkestatesplanning.com, and shoot us a message and say, hey, on the podcast, I'd like Jim to cover this. on the next question and answer session. Or if it's hitting closer home, especially if you're a Georgia resident, of course, we can't give legal advice on the podcast because it's not specific for your situation. But if you got a situation that you need to handle, it's important to get that done. So let's talk estateplanning.com is how to contact the office. I'd love to talk with you about the specifics of your situation and make sure your estate plan is everything that your family should have it be. In the meantime, we're going to go back to the episode. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope to talk to you soon. This also really is close to home for me because my brother, and I've mentioned it in other episodes, I believe that he's suffered with Parkinson's disease and also Lewy body dementia. And he really had a decline the earlier part of this year and died early this summer. You're not surprised to learn that he and my sister-in-law have a trust in place that they worked hard to get funded before his disease progressed so far. This spring, my sister-in-law and I spent a little bit of time talking about the accounts, talking about that checklist, and actually referred to that initial checklist that they started with to do the funding. And that conversation resulted in her making one phone call to the financial advisor to ask a couple questions and running by their bank to ask a couple questions. And she really didn't have to do anything to improve what they had already done because they put the work in. Now that he's passed away, she's not having to worry about all the administration of the accounts. They're all there at her disposal because she's the successor trustee. She's the surviving trustee. She continues on as trustee, and she's able just to pay the household bills and do those other things and concentrate on all the other things that come up when somebody dies. All the arrangements, the writing obituaries, just collecting yourself, because when you have, and this was true both for my sister-in-law and for Sam, my client that I was telling you about, because both spouses in those situations happen to have a prolonged and progressive illness, so much energy from the spouse is spent on making sure you got the right caregivers in place, making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to. It takes a long time to find the right fit for caregivers, and those don't always remain stable. And so that requires a lot of work and attention. It's this state of hypervigilance. And now that that is over, there's this exhaustion that is now allowed to set in that you couldn't really let in the door before when your loved one was still alive. So, as I say, it hits close to home, and I really see the difference between folks scrambling under a will to try and get a handle on things and folks that have put the work in on trust planning ahead of time that already really know where things are and that they're properly designated. So that's the checklist. It's sort of the question of somebody died, I'm the executor, what now? Well, you're going to walk through this legal process, and I've got other episodes about how to prepare for that initial consultation with an attorney when you're going into probate. But the checklist you're going to end up with very similar to this funding process. Which is not to say that funding process is not important when you do a will plan. Trust plans are not the right answer for every client I meet with. And when we do a trust plan, it's still important to go through the ownership and beneficiary designations on all the accounts to make sure that they're consistent with the plan and that they strike the plan when they should, that things happen so things go as easy as they can between the legal documents and the beneficiary designations and the ownerships, those sorts of things. How often to take a look at this? Probably annually, particularly if you're a little bit older, if you're, let's say, over 60, the likelihood that something's going to happen to you, either disability or death-wise, is higher. And so we make decisions every day during the year, and sometimes things stay very neatly house kept and sometimes not. So it's good to have an annual housekeeping just to meet. This conversation that my sister-in-law and I had in the spring was sort of an annual thing where we'd talk about it, and she was just confirming some things, and that's what made it so nice for her. So that annual keeping up with it, make sure that when it's your plan, make sure that when you die, your agents are going to have what they need to follow your instructions. The other thing that's important is that if you become disabled, and that can strike at any time through accident or illness, If you have sort of that annual checkup, making sure that everything is current, that should you become disabled, then again, your plan is going to kick into place to make sure that the choices that you've made are able to be carried out because you've made the housekeeping arrangements to make everything work smoothly. So the first reason to do those checkups is you could die. Second reason is you could become disabled in the foreseeable future. Now for folks like Sam and my sister-in-law, who are now faced with being sole trustee of the trust, making these annual checks are no longer about the two spouses. Now they're about those beneficiaries. And for it's like my aunt's estate that I've talked about in the past that I was the executor for. She had no children. My brother and sister-in-law didn't have any kids of their own. So it's a number of nieces and nephews. As you increase that number of nieces and nephews, and as you increase time, you also increase the likelihood that one of those beneficiaries could end up with a disability. So this is a good time to highlight one of the advantages to testamentary trust planning over beneficiary designations. Testamentary trust planning, whether it's in a will or a living trust, is better with contingencies. There's special needs trust planning you can have, waiting in the wings. If one of your beneficiaries becomes disabled, you appoint your administrator, whether it's your executor or your trustee. Here's some special needs provisions to use for that, folks. It ends up going, I ask people this all the time. What if you and your son are in the car together and you both get run over by the same Mack truck, no fault of your own, and you're both dead? You probably want your son's share to go to his kids. Well, they may be minors. Same thing, you can have some contingencies built in. This is where beneficiary designations on accounts, though they're really important and though they can often get the job done, are not as robust when you're talking about if-thens, contingencies. What happens if this happens? How are we going to handle that? And so that's where testamentary trust planning beats beneficiary designations, because it can accommodate readily for beneficiaries who are minors or who become disabled. So again, this conversation is all about accounts, assets, making sure that your ownership and beneficiary designations are coordinated. So if you find yourself as somebody's executor, hopefully they did a lot of this work for you and it's going to be easier. If you're successor trustee, all this stuff is all buttoned up inside the trust. If you're facing the death of your spouse, if you and your spouse put the work in to get all this stuff buttoned up in the trust and very neatly organized, you're going to have a lot less to worry about on the administrative side and can focus on the human side of it. And that's what I talk about. I tend to talk about that a lot because my entire practice, my entire law career has been working with families, usually when they're in crisis. And that's what really drove me to doing estate planning, because having this stuff prepared ahead of time makes it easier when crisis strikes, and it makes it more likely that the decisions that you make are going to be carried out the way you want them to be, because you've made it easier for those folks who are white knuckling it through. They are grieving. They can be very often devastated by what's occurred, and you're asking them now to act like great business managers. So probate, trust funding, same work, different day. It's better to do it ahead of time if you can. I don't have any clients who are sorry they've got a revocable living trust put in place. If this conversation has made you think, I'd like to know a little bit more about that, I want to talk about it. If you're a Georgia resident, set an appointment with my office. The URL for my website is Let's Talk Estate Planning, same as the podcast. I do workshops at least twice a month covering the basics of estate planning, sometimes specialized topics as well. On the website, you will find a good amount of reference material, but always happy to meet in person or remotely with folks to answer their direct questions. I'm Jim Miskell. I appreciated your time being here today, and I hope you found this conversation enlightening. It's really gratifying to me to meet with folks when crisis has struck and help them discover that the work they put in putting their plan together is really paying off and making things a whole lot easier for them now. I look forward to seeing you in future episodes. If there's a topic that's on your mind, check the episode list. We may have already talked about it, and hopefully you'll find that information helpful. Till next time, take care. Thanks very much.